With this video, I want to build a bridge between week 1 and week 2. And I'll do that by reviewing the objectives that we had for this week. Discuss those objectives in the context of your submissions, and then move on into next week's work, in which we will discuss the competencies of information design. We've already had a bit of an overview of what the field entails. We're going to dig in a little more deeply in the week ahead. If you recall, the week's objectives are to understand how the course is structured. We've begun to do that. I have some more work to do along those lines, and we'll get to that this week. To be exposed to key perspectives on the definition and scope is something we have certainly begun to do, and your comments and your posts reflect that. You're beginning to understand the scope of the field. We will continue that exploration next week, or this upcoming week, as we talk about competencies in the field. To establish connections with others in class and new sources of information, we've begun to do that as you've done the readings, and we will continue along those lines. And then see yourself in relation to other students. I hope to accomplish that objective more concretely today as we look at the materials that you've submitted. We start with John's submission and his learning interest of how to use information design strategies to overcome the challenges of communicating technically complex concepts in a way that the audience understands and appreciates. I think that's excellent focus for a learning interest. And I like the way you've rendered that, I think conceptually, using a narrative design, starting with a concept and the idea that with any concept comes way too much information, and develops the storm cloud there of these challenges, with an outcome being to be concise, be usable, be visually appealing, via principles of information design to rain showers of life upon our audience. So I think it's one of its virtues is the simplicity, the use of symbols that are immediately recognizable. By comparison, Catherine's approach is quite a bit more abstract and interesting for the visual continuity between the lightning bolt and the sunburst of energy. In both John's and Catherine's rendering, we see that upper left movement to lower right movement, as we are culturally trained here in the US anyway, to start in the upper left and move right. We will talk about cultural norms, cultural expectations further on down the road, but it's just interesting to see that in these two consecutive images that very familiar practice has been invoked. Kevin takes two approaches in the same image. One is linear, left to right, A to B, and suggesting a process, and then in the bottom half, sort of a spoke and hub, or hub and spoke design, suggesting centrality, using size to my mind, looks like perhaps importance is rendered in that. So you're beginning to explore shape and size and line as a factor that conveys meaning in all the work that we do. But we'll see that all of our design choices matter, and so strong information design is always intentional, as I'm sure you've gathered in many of your courses, and that will be the same in this one. Joshua uses familiar imagery in this design, the idea of the iceberg with just a little bit of its bulk, its full dimensionality showing, with a great deal of other variables lurking down below. Also, the pyramid, of course, is very meaningful to viewers in terms of peaks and bases and structure. And so this is pretty evocative in a lot of ways, suggesting that there's lots more to information design than meets the eye. Kristen's work is very interesting with respect to continuity between content and imagery. When Kristen, you write, I understand the concept, just I'm still confused and often stupefied when trying to create a design. For anyone who's not a visual person or isn't trained in design, it is difficult. And so what do? We often resort to icons and labeling, as you have done here, because these are the familiar objects. A book, if you want to talk about books, you put a picture of a book. If you want to talk about propaganda, you give us labels that have propaganda titles, or titles that we would associate with agenda-driven content. So, as a message to me, this is very powerful and very effective. Another information design principle of embedding is used here in Sean's work, and in which it's quite clear that Sean puts psychology at the center of his interests. Here, using labeling in a very simple and effective way to suggest that there are circles, there are degrees of interest, that interests are within interests, and topics are complex and sometimes submerged deep within the surrounding information. And I think this experience of getting to the center of things is useful for us in this class, because we have to dig to get into the center of user expectations and whatnot in order to get to that outer circle of a structure within which our goals will be achieved. Unlike circles and embedding, Cheng Tzu has chosen levels, suggesting the idea of what's at a base level and then what grows out of that base. Emotional power, anatomy, function, user-centered. These are all considerations that need to be made, and then that will also support the transformation of data, which you've so nicely shown to be somewhat chaotic unless there's some sort of order, or unless it's somehow straightened out. And so you've used layers and imagery and process all in one. Susan's taken an entirely different approach from the ones we've looked at so far, using text and the environment of an XHTML source page. So to many, this environment will be familiar, and you'll be able to discern code from comment. Otherwise, it's going to be, if it's not familiar, of course, then you have to dig through this and try to figure out what's going on. But but depending on the audience, then this is going to be very effective, and it gets at the complexity of your thinking, of Susan's thinking about the topic, and gives us lots to think about. One question is, how accessible is the information to somebody? And as you can see, text density adds a layer of complication. But once again, this is a quick exercise, and this is a sketch, and it's not meant to be a polished piece. And what's creative about it is the idea of this text, this code, this XHTML domain as being a site, as being a site that conveys meaning outside its intended meaning. And so I'm intrigued by it, and appreciate the level of detail in the commentary. What's so interesting about this exercise is that you're using, I mean, as a class, you're using more design elements than most people would use just independently. So here we have process, we have left to right, and we have vertical orientation as well with color. And we have levels of detail from the general to the patent field, and then some use of icons or branding to immediately identify where Wanzhong works, in what domains he works. Here Marissa's done an interesting job, I mean a good job of making all of the information interesting by showing process, using text and graphics to complement each other. And so here is an integrated approach. Some of you chose to do a rendering and then explain the rendering. And then in this case we have the use of columns and imagery to reinforce a key idea of Marissa's process, her journey from art to information design or technical communication, and then speculating about how all this will impact the future. And so this is a story. It's narrative, it's graphical, it's textual, and it's detailed in lots of important, effective ways. Kayleen's work is equally complex, and it does a good job of getting at the depth and breadth of the field. And then you framed it all, quite literally framed it within a learning process. So that's very effective with pointing out in some detail what the field what the field is comprised of, and what has to happen in order to be successful, building relationships, creating audience, sort of the many of the benefits of effective information design. Courtney is a really good example of focus, being selective, focusing on one aspect of the field, which is the designers, and then talking about finding a way to express in a very accessible way your interest by giving them numbers. And Brian had an initial diagram just of the circles and arrows here in this area, and then decided that really didn't get at it enough, and so he added some captions or some additional content that would elaborate on what he's trying to say here. And obviously, so by putting institutional leadership skills right in the center, he's using space as a design element. The addition of the extra text in order to elaborate on the key ideas that you first put in here helps to interpret the visual elements, so we understand what they signify, which is an important, obviously very important to do, because some imagery is connotative, and so it's easy to interpret. Some imagery, especially when we get into basic diagramming, is less meaningful, or it's more ambiguous. Therefore, the explication is required. Sean Kwan has used a traditional line diagram or flowchart here to group content together, using color and shape to group for us. We have to think about cognitive overload, so color helps us sort, and this is used very nicely in this case. Finally, Alex provides a story here in the traditional 1, 2, 3 format that many, I don't know how unique that is to the United States, but certainly things coming in threes is very common here. And he explains in his notes that he uses red to indicate that these two dimensions of information design are not ones he's interested in, whereas the green one is.